Under the stone floor of Saint Aurelia Chapel, there lay a bundle of letters wrapped in oilcloth that had not seen daylight in more than 2 centuries. The archive register listed them only as item 317, a sealed envelope transferred between diocesan vaults without public notice. The pages inside named something that sounded impossible for its time and place. A nun was recorded as pregnant. The notation was terse but categorical, written by a parish surgeon and witnessed by a confessor, and for decades the diocese had kept the envelope under lock. Today, those yellowed pages are open again. Today, we will trace how a single entry in an archival ledger unraveled reputations cathedral-wide and forced a small community to choose which truth to preserve. Sister Helena, 51 years old, was listed in the ledger as the head of the convent school and as a woman of devout practice. That she appeared in a medical note as expecting a child was a contradiction the Church could not afford to be public. We will read the letters, listen to the testimony preserved in margins, and reconstruct weeks that led to interrogation, a stunned tribunal, and a decision that echoed for generations. Documents from the diocesan vaults confirm the existence of the correspondence and medical reports. Before we proceed, tell us in the comments, do institutions protect truth or do they alter it to survive? Your answer matters to how we understand this case and to the community whose story we reopen. Voltemos now to the founding of Saint Aurelia and the town that grew in its shadow, though the narrative that follows will remain in English for clarity and accessibility. The chapel had been founded in 1732 on a hill that overlooked a river bend where trade boats slowed. The convent grew around an education mission and a small infirmary, both funded at first by merchants and later by the diocese. By the mid-18th century, the institution functioned as a node of social services, a place where orphans learned letters, where the sick found care, and where the town's moral compass was publicly affirmed. Power concentrated in the hands of a small number of clerical leaders. Records from tax ledgers and baptismal registers show that the convent received donations amounting to nearly a third of the municipal budget in several years, and that its staff exerted influence over school appointments and charitable distributions. The town depended on the convent for education and for the maintenance of social order. The chapel smelled faintly of beeswax and old books. The air in winter carried a metallic chill from the stove, and in summer was thick with river humidity. The sound of boots in the cloister at vespers kept time with the town clock. Candles guttered, stonework hummed with echoes, and confessionals held secrets that did not always stay secret. This proximity of charity and power created complex incentives for concealment. A scandal would not merely scandalize, it would challenge the very economy of social respectability that the community relied upon. To understand the shock of item 317, we must keep in mind that this was a place where reputation was both currency and control, and where the cost of losing face could be exile or worse. Sister Helena had served in the convent for more than 3 decades. She was known as a teacher of arithmetic and the Latin catechism, a stern hand in the embroidery room, and the woman who organized winter coal distributions to the town poor. Her childhood had been in a riverside hamlet across the county, where her mother had sold herbs and her father had died early. She entered religious life at 19, partly to secure an education and partly because the convent offered a stable home after a year of jobless wandering. Her letters to a cousin reveal a rigorous self-discipline and a tenderness for the children in her care. Those who knew her remembered an early promise to study herbal remedies and to learn midwifery so she could serve the infirm. She had read medical tracts smuggled from the city and corresponded with a retired surgeon about salves. The convent permitted study in exchange for managing classroom duties and composing sermons for local festivals. Over time, Sister Helena became headmistress. She kept accounts like a merchant and could be as persuasive overseeing the allocation of funds as any secular administrator. Yet behind the ledger, she kept private anxieties about aging and about her distance from birth and motherhood, for which the vows of celibacy had offered no consolation. Her private journals contained, in language muted by time, a longing for physical connection and a yearning to reconcile faith with bodily compassion. These passages show a woman who did not abandon devotions, but who imagined a role for care that included the act of birth itself. Her reputation for discipline and her network inside the convent allowed her to move in ways that were at once visible and deeply hidden. This backstory is recorded in her correspondence with Sister Beatrice and in accounts written by children she taught who later remembered Helena as both strict and mysteriously affectionate in private. Dr. Thomas Hale was the town surgeon whose signature appears on the medical note attached to item 317. Born in the city to a physician father, he trained in a small hospital where he learned to reconcile mechanical procedures with bedside empathy. He came to the town at age 28 to set up a practice and quickly became indispensable to both sailors and children. Hale kept careful notebooks. His medical marginalia reveal a restless curiosity and a practical hand during deliveries. Unlike the clerical officers, he had no interest in concealing facts, although he understood the necessity of discretion in a place where reputations could drive donations or withdraw them. In his backstory, he is presented as a man haunted by a failed marriage that left him skeptical of vows and protective of those who suffered. He had written to colleagues about the need for training midwives and had trained several women, including a pair of sisters who worked at Saint Aurelia. His notebooks show experiments with postpartum treatments and with early antiseptic techniques smoothed with wine and vinegar. He kept his ledger and his conscience in tension, and when he recorded Sister Helena as pregnant, he relied on clinical signs and on a notation about fetal heartbeat heard with a crude stethoscope-like device. He added a line about the necessity of secrecy because of the social fallout. Reading both backstories side by side, we see two figures whose paths crossed in an institution that prized order over individual need. One motivated by a private longing, the other by a professional ethic, and both willing to act in ways that would later be judged. Between routine inventory entries and the shock of the medical note, there were first signs of tension. A grain of salt in a ledger, a missing stitch in a habit, or a whisper caught in the refectory could grow into accusation. The initial discovery scene is recorded in a short parish memorandum and a later testimony that survived because a junior clerk copied it into his diary. The clerk wrote that a midwife named Marta found Helena faint after Vespers and that she had taken her to the infirmary where Dr. Hale examined her. Marta described the smell of heated sage, the wet weight of linens, and the low moan of a woman in pain. In the margins, the confessor scribbled a cryptic comment about sin and mercy. This discovery started as a private medical case but quickly gained a social dimension because the infirmary reported the pregnancy to the vicar and because a junior nun accidentally left the exam report on a desk that a visiting layman later glimpsed. The reactions were immediate and visceral. Sister Agnes, who managed the embroidery room, went pale. Father Martel, who oversaw the school meetings, slammed a folio shut and asked for quiet counsel. Isabella Cruz, a town matron, whispered to Mayor Jonathan Reed, who paced outside the chapel and worried about donors withdrawing funds. People looked at Sister Helena with a new lens, and the language shifted from pity to suspicion. The sensory details here are dense. Candles dripping hot wax, a faint metallic tang from the surgeon's instruments, the rustle of silk, and the distant river bells. Those minor impressions became evidence in the court of reputation even before any formal inquiry began. The investigation that followed unfolded in a formal way and in persistent private questioning. The diocese sent an emissary to assess the claim and to decide whether the matter required a canonical trial or could be handled within the convent. Archive letters show that the emissary requested sealed depositions and sealed minor trials. A procedural note elaborates on how evidence would be gathered. Interviews would be documented in duplicate with a witness present, and medical reports would be compared to contemporaneous baptismal and birth records. The technical description of the medical examination that appears in the files is precise and clinically matter-of-fact. The surgeon recorded palpation of the abdomen, presence of fetal movement, dated by subjective waking cycles, and a notation about an internal exam performed with gloved fingers to confirm presentation. He wrote a line about the placenta and about the risks of clandestine childbirth in a community lacking formal midwifery oversight. The surgical note also explained a method of preserving a chain of custody for the report by sealing it in an envelope signed across the closure by the doctor, the confessor, and the superior. This procedure appears mundane on paper, but was designed to protect reputational interests and to ensure that any record could be produced or suppressed with plausible deniability. The interrogation scenes were sharp and lasted several days. The transcript that survives in 3 independent copies shows extended exchanges between Sister Helena, Dr. Hale, Father Martel, and the diocesan emissary. The main interrogation, in which the narrative tension concentrates, contained 10 exchanges between Helena and the emissary and supportive interruptions by the confessor and the surgeon. The dialogue unfolded with precise escalation as follows. The emissary began in a formal tone by asking for Helena to account for the medical note. Helena responded with measured denial at first, then with a halting admission about sickness and a claim of delirium. The emissary pressed with a second question about the timeline and about how a woman of religious vows could be in such a condition without knowledge of breach. Helena answered that she had felt a strange weakness and had sought medical solace. Dr. Hale interjected with clinical observations, insisting that the science pointed to an advanced pregnancy. The emissary asked if anyone else had assisted in secrecy, and Helena named Marta and another sister who had been in the infirmary. The emissary demanded to know the father, and Helena refused to reveal a name, invoking sacred silence and alleged coercion. The confessor asked for a private confession, and Helena hesitated. The emissary warned of potential penalties, and Helena finally disclosed a sequence of events that implicated a lay tutor who had visited to teach music. The emissary questioned the tutor directly, and the tutor denied allegations, insisting that all contact was instructional. Dr. Hale challenged the tutor with the medical report, and the tutor broke into partial admission, claiming a relationship that had been brief and troubled. The emissary then insisted on witnesses and called Sister Beatrice, whose testimony was partial and protective, leaving more questions than answers. The interchange ended with the emissary ordering temporary removal of Helena to a secluded infirmary pending the tribunal. The entire scene reads as a court drama and contains 8 to 10 exchanges, not only in spoken words, but in pauses, in breathing, the rustle of robes, the tapping of quill, and the heavy silence when the candidate refused to speak. Sensory descriptors: the metallic scent of the surgeon's instruments, the wool of the habit pressed against skin, the distant barking of a dog outside, and the dry, papery sound of turning pages. These details give texture to an interrogation that proved decisive in shaping the subsequent tribunal. At roughly 1/3 into this reconstruction, we pause to ask you a direct question, because public opinion mattered then as it matters now. Perceive how the case divides those who see Sister Helena as victim and those who see her as violator of vows. It is impossible not to be pulled between compassion and indignation. I want to know your stance. Do you think Sister Helena acted from sincere maternal impulse or from calculated ambition to secure favor and influence for her lineage? Type only faith or ambition and add a single sentence explaining why. Your responses will help map public perception as we continue through testimonies that will polarize the town. Thank you for participating. Now we return to the testimony that shifted everything and that you will judge for yourselves. The tribunal convened in the diocesan hall with a mixture of religious formality and municipal theater. The hall smelled of dust and tallow. Sunlight through high windows cut across dust motes and illuminated faces with cruel clarity. Records show the presence of an archdeacon, a presiding bishop, Father Martel, and 3 lay advisors, including Mayor Reed. The prosecution framed the case as an offense against the vow of celibacy and as a breach of trust that threatened the moral fabric from which the town drew charity. The defense argued for mercy and for a recognition of medical reality that complicated moral judgment. The moment of climax occurred when a child was born in the infirmary under surveillance, and the tribunal had to confront the physical presence of the new life. That birth scene provides strong sensory contrast. Nurses moved with wet hands, the air smelled of salt and herbal wash, the infant cried with thin, high intensity, and Sister Helena held the child with a face contorted in an expression that mixed exhaustion and relief. The tribunal debated whether to record the child as illegitimate or as under the protection of the convent. The decisive confrontation included 10 rapid exchanges between the bishop and Dr. Hale about whether the delivery had been assisted secretly or whether it had been a managed medical act permitted for life-saving reasons. The bishop asked whether any active conspiracy had occurred, and Dr. Hale testified about deliberate concealment lists and about an instance when Sister Agnes had wrapped linens and placed them in an oven to erase traces. The bishop responded by admonishing the convent's leadership for failure to guard chastity and for prioritizing reputation. Meanwhile, public reaction outside the hall turned from whispered sympathy to open fury as rumor spread. This scene combined technical detail, emotion, and institutional procedure in a way that would define the narrative for years. There are procedural passages in the archive that require technical description. One describes how the chain of custody for the medical sample was maintained. A small cloth containing a swath of placenta was placed in a glass jar filled with alcohol, then sealed with wax. The wax seal was impressed with the emblem of the diocese and signed on the surface by the attending surgeon, the superior, and the confessor. A separate copy of the medical note was locked in a chest whose key was retained by the archdeacon. This process was intended both to preserve physical evidence and to create a documented chain that could be produced in canonical proceedings or suppressed under advisement. That procedural record is clinical and speaks to a bureaucracy that balanced compassion and containment. Community reaction named characters and assigned actions. Sister Agnes closed the embroidery room and refused to speak with the press. Father Martel convened emergency prayers and wrote a letter to the archdeacon. Archivist Eleanor Price removed related documents from the general ledger and placed them in a private chest. Mayor Jonathan Reed stood at the chapel steps and appealed to donors to remain calm. Isabella Cruz organized a petition calling for clemency. Marta the midwife provided a steady, if conflicted, testimony. Mateo Alvarez, a music tutor, was implicated in testimony and left town within days. Sister Beatrice offered protective statements and later recanted parts of her account when threatened with censure. Dr. Hale documented all medical steps and was criticized for breaking clerical silence, though he argued he had acted to protect life. Each named person performed a particular action, reaction, or silence, and the archive records their choices. They became, together, a chorus that shaped public memory. There were moments of tension that the archive returns to with insistence. The first occurred when the surgeon revealed the clinical note to the archdeacon in private, and the archdeacon read the phrase that declared a woman of vows to be expecting. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of calculation and dread. That moment required immediate judgment about whether to inform the public and whether to pursue a canonical trial. The second moment of tension arrived when a visiting layman claimed to have glimpsed the medical report on a desk and threatened to publish it in a pamphlet if the town refused to act. The town reacted with panic and with the first hints of a desire to bury the matter. The third came during the tribunal itself, when the newborn first wailed and reality trumped abstract doctrine. Each of these moments carried heavy human cost and required decisions that would be judged by later generations. They are described in the record with the intensity of pauses, the scraping of chairs, the quick exchange of glances, and a sudden intake of breath when a sentence was pronounced. Those moments are compact narratives that crystallize the case in scenes of moral drama. The tribunal delivered mixed outcomes. The official sentence recorded the diocesan minutes balanced censure with pastoral care. Sister Helena was formally admonished and placed under supervised confinement, yet was not expelled. The child was taken into the temporary guardianship of Isabella Cruz, who agreed to rear the infant as a ward under the condition that the convent pay for its maintenance. Dr. Hale received a reprimand for failing to protect confidentiality, though he was not stripped of his license. Mateo Alvarez was banned from the town for 2 years and required to make reparations. Father Martel was asked to resign from certain oversight duties, though he remained in minor clerical office. The verdict attempted to calibrate punishment with charity and to prevent a full collapse of the charitable functions that the community needed. Nevertheless, the consequences were severe in human terms. Sister Helena lost her status as headmistress and was reassigned to quiet labor. Sister Agnes left the convent in shame and moved with a niece to a neighboring parish. Several children who had been under Helena's care were reassigned, and the school suffered a drop in donations that took years to recover. The convent sealed several rooms and removed pages from ledgers in an effort to erase the scandal, though copies survived in private hands. The legal and social maneuvers included documented acts of concealment. Letters show that some funds were redirected to pay for a discreet relocation of certain records. The rival diocesan office in the city received a sealed shipment that the shipment manifest lists only as charity goods. A sequence of entries in merchant ledgers indicates payments to a coppersmith for the manufacture of sealed boxes. These maneuvers were calculated to manage reputation and to ensure that the convent could continue supplying education and food without losing patrons. Some of these tactics were later criticized by reformers as manipulative. Others defended them as necessary to preserve services for the poor. There were personal costs. Sister Helena lived her final years with a quiet kind of sorrow. The child grew up under the guardianship of Isabella and later apprenticed to a tailor in a town beyond the river without knowing the origin of its name. Dr. Hale continued to practice medicine and to keep his notebooks, though he never fully regained the trust of some parish families. Mateo Alvarez traveled for work and receded into anonymity. Father Martel retained a minor role but lost voice in school appointments. The convent eventually reopened the sealed chapel, but with different custodians. Memory of the incident faded into local rumor and then into a cautionary tale told in quiet tones. We must attend to the ethical and theological dilemmas that the case raises. The need to protect the vulnerable often collides with institutional imperatives to preserve reputation. The vow of celibacy, intended to free clergy and religious to serve without familial obligations, also created a structure that could silence suffering and obscure human needs. The archives invite a question. When institutions prioritize survival, do they become complicit in harm? The documents show both care and concealment. The medical notes show attempts to save life, while the administrative letters show equal effort to manage narrative. This tension is not unique to one time or place, and it resonates today when organizations face scandal and must choose between transparency and containment. 3 procedural vignettes appear in the archive, and each contains technical detail. One records the method for documenting witness interviews. A scribe was present at each interview and wrote a direct transcript in 2 copies, one retained by the diocesan registry, the other sealed and given to the presiding bishop. The copies were dated, stamped, and signed across the fold. This preserved both the method and the possibility of selective disclosure. Another technical note describes midwifery practice used in the infirmary, where herbal steam with rosemary and chamomile was used along with poultices soaked in wine to prevent infection, and where the attending physician used a rinsed linen cloth and oil to lubricate. A third procedural entry explains how the baptismal registry was amended in extremis when the infant was baptized privately to ensure sacramental status. Each of these entries has 250 to 350 characters in the original shorthand and speaks to the intersection of ritual and medical practice. By the close of formal proceedings, the town faced consequences that touched ordinary life. Donations to the convent dipped, and redistributed support went to a secular school that opened after reformers argued for accountability. Several families relocated their daughters to city academies. The case became a talking point in neighboring parishes, with sermons that alternately praised mercy and denounced laxity. Presses in the city printed a few scornful pamphlets and then moved on. Over time, the scandal softened into a moral anecdote, but the archival evidence persisted. Now, the epilogue traces the aftermath in 3 temporal moments that together form the legacy. 1 month later, the immediate practical arrangements had been set in place. The child had been lodged with Isabella Cruz, and the convent had closed 2 small rooms that had been used for private care. Donors had pledged limited funds to ensure food distribution remained uninterrupted. The town's gossip network churned, and letters to the city criticized both the diocese and the civil authorities for handling the matter without full transparency. Tensions remained high among low-income families who worried about the reliability of care and about whether the moral authority of the chapel would now be compromised. 3 months later, the social landscape had shifted further. A small secular school had opened in a rented hall, drawing away some pupils. The mayor convened a public forum about institutional oversight, though many clergy avoided attending. Dr. Hale had his reputation discussed in the marketplace, and some women refused him as their surgeon for fear of scandal by association. Sister Helena had been allowed brief supervised visits with the infant, but remained under constraint. The convent had replaced 2 senior staff members and was engaged in a slow program of reform that included new training for midwives and new protocols for reporting medical cases to diocesan authorities. The community was weary. Some older donors had written angry letters, while younger families quietly moved their children into different circles of influence. 6 months later, the immediate outrage had waned into a more complicated set of social memories. The child had been apprenticed and would later marry a craftsman in another town. Sister Helena was still alive and spent long days tending a small garden in the cloister, her work quiet and visible, and her life a study in endurance. The convent had regained some donations after implementing oversight measures and after a public apology by the archdeacon that acknowledged both failure and a pledge to improve care. The town had adopted new rules for transparency, and a small committee, including lay members, had been created to review future cases. The scandal left behind a mixed legacy: reforms that improved midwifery and health care, but also a cautionary tale about the limits of institutional mercy. The combined epilogue text shows how a single event spurred both progressive change and lingering wounds, and demonstrates that historical memory is not erased but rewritten through acts of governance and of ordinary life. We close with a reflection and an invitation. The pages we read are both evidence and narrative. They reveal a woman who acted within a web of human need and institutional protection. The letters and the medical notes show that faith and scandal are not opposites, but often companions in human history. A child was born, a life continued, and a community was forced to confront structural contradictions that had long been invisible. If this story moved you, and you want more investigations that bring documents, testimony, and human consequence to light, please subscribe. We bring researchers and experts to read archives and to ask difficult questions, so that lost voices can be heard. The past rarely yields simple answers, but it does offer lessons about how institutions shape lives and how silence can cost more than disclosure. Tell us again in the comments, faith or ambition, and one sentence why. Your perspective helps map how modern readers interpret historical dilemmas. In the end, the lesson is solemn and simple. Secrets may protect institutions, but they often leave human beings paying the price.